District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, you know, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Welcome to a special Sunday edition of District of Conservation. This topic today is a little closer to home for those of us who live in Virginia or the states bordering Virginia and you frequent the national forests. This forest in particular, I happen to have an annual pass to the George Washington and Jefferson forest. I buy the permit annually. I've gone to and I've fished out of the northernmost section closer to West Virginia and Shenandoah. But a portion of this national forest, of the 16% of federal lands, public lands that we have in Virginia, will be affected by a new Forest Service closure in wake of Hurricane Helene response. And a couple I brought on today are fellow Virginians who I first learned about this from through Eric Erickson, who is someone I know through politics, Mark and Shallon, who run a fantastic Substack about Appalachia. And I want them both to talk about this and how they found out about this. So Mark and Shallon, thank you both for joining. And I think, Shallon, you run the Substack account. Maybe both of you do. But how did you first both learn about this closure and talk about how it's been in response to Hurricane Helene recovery efforts, if you can?
Thank you. And we do both run the Substack.
Perfect.
We are hunters and we come from a hunting family. So news traveled fast through the hunting community when this order was put into place. And that's how we found out about it. Immediately, we began to take action to contact all of our governmental representatives because it is quite an excessive order. So as you know, the area of Jefferson alone is 703,000 acres. The total in Jefferson and Washington is 1.8 million acres. We live just on the edge of the Jefferson National Forest here in Wise County, Virginia, in the Clinch Ranger District. And so we know exactly how much impact has occurred in our area. And in the Jefferson National Forest here in the Clinch District, it was very minimal. There is nothing that should prevent hunters from entering the woods here.
And you detailed this in your Appalachian Homestead Substack, and you have created a letter for your subscribers and those who read to send a letter to the Forest Service and also to members of Congress more so specifically. But you should also create one, hopefully, if you have the bandwidth, to the Forest Service, because they respond whenever a lot of emails come in because they're supposed to be attentive to people's needs. So you have a letter template explaining that the Mount Rogers District and also the Clinch Ranger District of the National Forest have not been damaged. It's a very easily template, and you're hoping that through contacting both House and Senate members that it'll force the USDA to reconsider the blanket closures, as you mentioned. That's a lot of acreage, 1 million acres. How many people close to you or you think would be adversely impacted if this temporary order, which we'll go into a little bit more of, were to stay in effect? And from my understanding, when I read the update, they said it would go into effect October 2nd and last a year, the following year until October 1st of 2025. I've never heard of such a declaration in my years of working in politics and conservation politics. This seems very excessive. So how many people do you think would be impacted by such a closure?
Well, first of all, let's mention one thing. I definitely understand that there are areas, especially in the George Washington National Forest, close to Damascus, along the Virginia Creeper Trail, and in flood impacted areas in that area over there that absolutely close them. We can't hunt there anyway. It's far too damaged.
Correct.
But when you get up here to the Clinch Ranger District or into pockets of the George Washington National Forest that are unaffected, those closures don't make sense. Here we were unaffected, so it doesn't. Now, how many families do I think this will impact? I will be honest with you. I think it will be across the area, thousands upon thousands. In Wise County alone, I don't know how many hunting licenses are sold annually, but I can tell you that I don't know very many families that don't have at least one hunter in them.
So it's a lot of families that could go hungry if they largely sustain off of wild game meat. Yes. So especially the families that we are intimately familiar with and our own, these forests are primary food sources. So my adult son who's married, he feeds his family all year from what he hunts and fishes in the national forest. And just the day that this declaration went into place, he and his wife had just purchased their hunting licenses hours before, which, by the way, are not being refunded, nor are the national forest stamps being refunded. So the immediate impact for us was my son called and he said, "Mom, I don't know what I'm going to do. Red meat that comes from venison and other things that we hunt is not the same as chickens that we can raise and slaughter. And we need this red meat. I don't know how I'm going to feed them if I can't hunt." That is the sentiment that is rippling across the region. This will cripple the families that depend on these public lands for their food.
It isn't just a recreational activity. It's not just a pastime or a sport. Most of the people who hunt here are earnest harvesters. They use every piece of the meat and the hide and everything they can for a worthwhile purpose. It's not just recreation that they're cutting out. They're not, "Oh, we're closing down this lake. You can't go water skiing. You can't do this." This is a food source. This is something people rely on. They use it, they harvest it, and they preserve it to use and eat and feed their families for an entire year, every year.
Yes.
And
we're not.
Go ahead.
We're not a trophy hunting area. Nobody here is hunting trophies. They are here hunting food.
I think most hunters tend to be of that mindset, especially here in Virginia, because our deer tend to be a little smaller. They're not as trophy size, so to speak, as some other states, but they provide enough of meat and it supplies, a lot through the season, through the year. Mark, have you ever seen an order like this from the Forest Service before? Or have either of you recalled something of this magnitude ever being issued for a natural disaster that has come through the area? Or this is an unprecedented first time?
Well, that prompts me to two things. No, I'm not. And it seems to be a very large blanket area that may have looked good and sounded good in a rushed moment in a far off office in a city. And the second point is it's awful quiet. I don't hear this in the local news. I have not heard a word about it on the local television stations. And they are into everything, even small events, small this or that. This is very, very quiet. And I believe, I don't know if that's intentional or what's going on, but to have something of such great magnitude and affect so many people, it sure is getting out very slowly and only by word of mouth by those who have stumbled upon this information. Strange.
I hope I can be the first to start kind of a storm here, metaphorically speaking, of attention, because we like to focus on these kind of under the radar issues, especially here in our backyard, even though it's a few hours away. This is extremely important. But I'm looking at the temporary order that Shallon had sent to me that's available publicly for people to read in terms of what this forest order entails. That would be effectively in effect until October of next year, unless terminated before, whichever occurs first. So there are different penalties if you're to enter any of the closure areas in the Clinch Ranger District and also the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. And they have a couple exemptions. But what what can be gleaned from this, from my understanding, and I'll link to the show notes for everyone to see this, and I'll have you both talk more about this. So if you violate any of the prohibitions set forth, they're punishable of a fine of no more than $5,000 for an individual, $10,000 for an organization, or imprisonment of no more than 6 months, or both. So could you both speak to some of the penalties that they might issue to people who might not be aware of the areas that are closed, and who would be impacted?
So before we move on to this question, I want to talk about one thing that
Absolutely,
Mark
sure.
didn't address. You asked if there had been any other closures. There have been lots of other storms that have come through this area. There was the catastrophic flooding of East Kentucky that just sits on the opposite side of the mountain about 14 miles from us in 2022, July. It wasn't closed then. We had what we called in the area a snowpocalypse in 2009 and 2020 or 2017 or 2015. It wasn't closed then. And there were thousands upon thousands of downed trees at that time, as well as downed power lines, etc. There were also people without power and lots of road issues and access issues getting into the mountains if you wanted to go hunt. So there is no precedent for this occurring. At other times during other major storms, such as we've had straight line winds in excess, I believe, of at times like 40 and 50 miles an hour that have created lots of tree damage. Never have we closed in one particularly impacted area was High Knob, Virginia, which is right there in the Jefferson National Forest. And they didn't close it at that time. This storm that came through was terrible in a lot of places. It absolutely devastated places like Irwin, Damascus, Asheville, Newport, and down in that area. But here in this area, it was no worse than any other very bad storm we've had roll through.
We've had worse storms this summer in our county and our surrounding counties that did take down some power lines and did have some fallen trees. Nothing like Damascus is experiencing, and parts of North Carolina and East Tennessee. But to close north of Interstate 81, because what happened south of Interstate 81?
You mean east and west?
East, west, north, south.
Okay.
Yeah. West of 81 and south of 81. Really, it's a giant blanket statement and decision that affects more than it needs to, far more than it needs to, in a negative way.
It sounds like it just.
So the air.
Go ahead. No. It definitely sounds like it. And when you read this and how strenuous and restrictive it is, using developed recreational sites, forest roads, trails, camping, traversing any of the National Forest System lands. So most of the hunters like yourselves who would be recreating or using the Forest Service lands here, you're not using a service road to my knowledge. You guys are doing largely backcountry hunting. So right. These closures that they're doing, should it really impact hunting or because hunters use different infrastructure bits, they don't necessarily traverse. I mean, you can't hunt from the road. It's illegal here in Virginia to do that. I don't know if that went into their decision making here. And some other things, whenever you take hunter's ed, you don't hunt directly from the road. You don't go off of a trail where people are hiking. You have designated areas. So this seems to be crafted to hurt hunters who are lawful in areas where it's already prohibited to go hunting, but make it more strenuous. So could you explain a little bit more into the temporary order of where they're enforcing this forest order?
So this forest order, you cannot roll a tire onto a road that goes through the national forest. You cannot step a foot onto national forest to hike through it for any reason whatsoever, which, as we've talked about, hunters don't hunt established trails. We're not following those. That's where people are. You don't do that. You don't hunt roadways. That's not safe. We don't need access to a roadway in order to hike into the national forest and hunt. The national forests here border lots of public roads that are still open that don't necessarily run through just the national forest. Also, one thing we haven't addressed here is you can't go and fish those lakes either. It's not just about hunting. It's October. This is when trout stocking happens.
Correct.
This is when fishing starts to happen as well across the winter, because it stops in May, because the water gets too warm. So we're not just talking about hunting. We're also talking about fishing. Sure, it's not great to not be able to go hike the trails, but we're not trying to do that. We're trying to provide food. So I can understand the closure of facilities and campgrounds. Absolutely. It would be difficult to get into those and to utilize those. But to close it down to access for people who would be going into these forests exclusively to hunt or fish, that's ludicrous. There is an assumed risk when you enter the woods. There are trees all around you. You know there's a potential that one could fall. It could kill you. It could prevent you going back the same track you went in. There are lots of risk in the forest. Animals. That's assumed risk. That's something that when we purchase a hunting license and we step into the woods, we know that this is a potentially dangerous place, especially with other hunters out there with weapons and shooting. But it's an assumed risk. It's one that we understand and we acknowledge, and we go in anyway.
Did you want to add anything to that, Mark?
I think she covered it well. I mean, not everyone is a hunter. Not everyone believes in the harvesting of animals, but this affects hikers. You can't even go hiking in these national forests far away from storms that happened up the road, or you're liable to get a federal arrest on your record, maybe spend time in jail, maybe pay a great large fine simply for being there. Something's off here. Something's odd.
On public land.
And I'm not familiar with Joby P. Tim. He's the forest supervisor for George Washington and Jefferson National Forest. So I think my listeners are aware that even in states, you have federal managers over public lands. Just that's how the network of lands are managed. So this person is local to the area, signs off on these different directives. Do you know if certain law enforcement would be helping to enforce this, or have even law enforcement in your county said this is too egregious, we will not be complying? Or have you tried to talk to the governor's office and some other folks who could urge this person to reconsider, even though, again, it is a little bit of a different jurisdiction, but it is in Virginia. So the governor could have a pull here, or someone of his stature. Yeah.
You would think so. And maybe his opinions will change, or he'll be better informed. I am in law enforcement. Shallon's brother is in law enforcement, and we have and our son works in the Department of Corrections for the state. We have friends who are Virginia game wardens, and we spoke to them about this. We didn't think it was true when we first heard it, and they said, yes, it is a federal law. But if you're on that land and I find you there and I'm there with you, I have to summons you. I have to cite you. I have to do what I need to do to enforce this, even though it's a federal order, not a state order. And this gentleman is a great person. He's a friend of ours. He said, that's the guidance we have been given from Richmond. We are to enforce it. And if we encounter you out in the woods, you're subject to a $5,000 fine or maybe even an arrest.
Right. He did comment that it would be very difficult for him to enforce that he doesn't necessarily.
There's only one of him or a few of him for this entire area for all his acres. And there's even less federal law enforcement down here. When I was active and on the road, I knew of one, and it was hit and miss whether he was out doing anything or not. And that's a lot of land for one person to cover. But then you've got hunters who want to do the right thing. They may not encounter a game warden for years, but they're still going to buy that license because it's the right thing to do. They're going to play by the rules. But this rule has really thrown us for a loop. It's out of the blue. It's being implemented without public knowledge, I believe. And I don't think people here understand the implications that it will have on us, because they don't know what's happening. They don't know this has occurred. I've asked several times, are there signs? Is there news reports? Are there this? Are there that? Nothing. You have to go look for this. And then when you find it, yes, you will be arrested. You will have a $5,000 federal fine. So getting back to your question, it'll be up to the Virginia game wardens to enforce this, as I understand. and the very, very, very few federal law enforcement in this area. There are employees here. If you look on a list and charts, there are federal forest employees here. But I know for a fact only a couple of them have a vehicle and they actually leave the office.
Yes.
Have you
you talked about the superintendent, or really the main person, the supervisor, for this area. He's based in Roanoke. I tried to give him a call this past week. He's based in Roanoke,
which is a good
way. It's 150 miles from where I'm sitting right now.
Mm-hmm.
And they consolidate, and I understand the need for consolidation and this and that. But someone in Roanoke and probably some people in Richmond made this decision, and then they forgot about it. The decision was made without really understanding the implications it would have on thousands of people, thousands. And I'm not talking about loss of recreational activities. I'm talking about loss of food in the house to eat.
Correct. And, this area is an underserved population in most aspects as it is. So, and also an impoverished population. So let's just take that into account. The hunting license, you can get several deer, and that meat will feed and if there's, for instance, Mark and I both hunt, we can feed our family for about 16 to 18 months off of what we're allowed to harvest.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you take that same $100 and you go down to the grocery store, I would be hard pressed to feed you for a week.
You'd be able to carry it in with both hands.
Yes.
With inflation,
so
yes.
You're talking about a region that is impoverished. You're talking about a region that this is part of our culture. This is part of our tradition. It's our food source. We have always been underserved and ignored. And now they've just added insult to injury.
Which of the lawmakers or relevant folks in our state government, and maybe you have reached out to, I know you said that you reached out to the supervisor. He should be easy to reach because he is a public servant. He has to be responsive to the needs of people, even if it's a federal, property or federal land, such as Forest Service. They have to be attuned, because if they're not responsive to the needs of people, they're not doing their job. That's an argument that people forget, that they're serving at the pleasure of the public. And if they're not doing their job, allowing for access in a reasonable manner, they could be seen as being derelict in their duties.
That's very true. And when you go through the phone tree trying to reach the superintendent, it is a phone tree, and you're going on menus, and we'll call you back or leave a message or this and that. And to be honest with you, I was not in the right state of mind to have a conversation with that gentleman that day. And I did not try the next day. So I did send an email to the governor, a very impassioned email. I did get a confirmation that we've received your email, and then that's it. Nothing else. It's just very odd that our state would allow this to happen to its citizens because of this blanket order made somewhere afar. Because some people are going through the worst tragedy I hope they ever have to go through, and nothing ever happens worse. It's bad. It is really bad. But you don't make a blanket order for Roanoke when something happens in Richmond. And that's kind of what they did.
Yes, it is that far apart. It is absolutely. And to add to who we've reached out to, I have emailed our congressman. I have spoken with Nick Freitas, who's not our representative at all. And he has helped me quite a bit to get a bug in the ears of people like Israel Oakland and our representatives like Terry Kilgore and Glenn Youngkin. And I've emailed almost everybody you can think of. And earlier today, I shared the email to the chiefs of staff for Warner and Kane.
Oh, good.
So I have not only attempted all of this myself, but I've called up my army of friends to help us across the nation, because I think this is something that, yes, we're in Virginia and we're focused on 2 national forests that are in Virginia. But if we set this precedent here, that just because some trees fall in the forest, we're going to close it. What's to stop it from spreading?
And we've also heard, well, there's down power lines. I understand that, but I've been in the woods. Those are very few and very far between. And I can tell you the power company around here has done a great job bringing in contractors, replacing poles, putting that stuff up. And I've got enough common sense to know that when a power line goes down, the meter on the other end of it is not running. The power company is going to do what it takes to get that back up. It's not just going to be like they forgot about it. Oh, there's a power line down across the mountain and we didn't even know about it. They know. But it's very few and very far between that you have power lines running through national forests. If you do, it may be the very large transmission lines with nothing could hurt. And if it's a small run going to a place, a community or a house, that is minuscule compared to the 108 or 703,000 acres, 1.8 million acres. You can't tell me there's power lines running through every bit of that.
Right. There's no grid running across it.
Or hunters, I think they've seen fallen trees before. I think they've probably walked around them or over them before. This isn't the first time a tree has fallen in the woods.
Right. And I think, people look to see where the damage is occurring, and it does seem to be a lot more hard hit outside of Virginia. Virginia did, of course, get some pockets of devastation. Nothing, thankfully, as bad as Asheville or some of the neighboring states. But from what, Shallon, you had sent me in terms of footage, it does look very safe for the most part in the areas you told me that have not been affected by the storm to not have closures. So I'm hoping you are able to get some response from our lawmakers, whether it's the U.S. senators, who should be able to use their connections and be close to the federal agencies, because that's what senators do. I'm hoping the state administration will be responsive to. I think the governor will be, and I'll talk to my contacts that I know in natural resources and see what I could do there if they're not already aware. But from my understanding, it seems to be the decision came from this federal guy in Roanoke. I don't think it came from Youngkin himself. I would not see him doing this, right. shutting down the forest. Yeah, so
we wholeheartedly agree with that. Yeah. We agree. We just want to make sure he understands that it is happening in his state, yes, and the impact it has on Virginians. Yes. And you mentioned who we might have contacted and any kind of response we've gotten back. This is a story you might want to hear.
So when I attempted to contact Tim Kaine's people, I got a kickback that said that they didn't accept messages from just everyone.
Really?
And also, yes. So, and also in addition to that, and this is something we haven't talked about, but it's super important, and I don't want us to forget it in the
please convey
course
it. Yes.
Of this conversation, is not only are we not allowed to go into hunt, fish, or do any other activity inside of these forests. Today was supposed to be the opening day of archery season. As a hunter, I'm sure you know that we've been preparing for this for a while, and we have equipment inside those national forests that we are not allowed to retrieve without the risk of the fine and the time in jail.
That's crazy. With Senator Kaine's office, it doesn't matter your zip code if you're from Virginia. They should be able to respond to your...
They should be able to. Oh. They should be able to.
You would think so, and especially being on the ballot, you would think he was extra receptive this time of year.
When he pretends to be for hunters, if we're being honest, when he feigns interest for sportsmen and women.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that we all know that politicians tend to be in favor of a lot of things when they're on the campaign trail that they're not actually in favor of when it comes time for the actual action that it takes to make these things happen and be available to the citizens.
And it reminded me of a sporting event. You can think professional sports, high school sports, whatever, college sports. If the University of Virginia football game is getting rained out, that doesn't mean that Virginia Tech, their game is canceled too.
That's correct.
It's just that simple.
You would think common sense would be dictating things here, but I don't know how familiar you are with a lot of kind of the conservation policy in my show, but I'm hoping we can revisit with this. I would love to hopefully get another update when I come back from my reporting trip I was telling you about, Shallon. But it's good to get this out before I leave because it's extremely important. But this has been happening, these closures, all of a sudden, millions upon millions of acres for no reason, but there is an explicit reason, which I won't bore you details of. We've seen a lot of closures of federal lands, especially out west, under certain people in charge right now. So to me, my thinking is a little more cynical, that because they put the emergency response, or what they think is an appropriate emergency response, ahead of access instead of balancing both, they've done this very arcane, very obtuse, unreasonable rule, just putting this blanket prohibition instead of, tackling certain areas or putting warning signs. So to me, it does seem very habitual and consistent with what we've seen happening federally. And it makes me angry that, as a sportswoman, to see this happening and in a place like Virginia, where public land is so scarce. And like you said, the food component, it's not just about having fun and access, which are, necessary for hunting and a big part of hunting and fishing, but feeding your family, especially in these high inflationary times. The grocery store, every time I go there, when I'm not able to supply, wild game for myself, it's ridiculous. And like you said, people in Wise County in southwestern Virginia, they don't have the means that a lot of us in Northern Virginia, where the two senators live. I know Mark Warner lives pretty close to me, comparably speaking, and I don't recall where Tim Kaine lives, but they both reside in Northern Virginia, and they seem to be out of touch with what happens in southwestern Virginia. So it's not surprising for me to see this, and it's really abhorrent. So I'm hoping with our conversation here on this format, and I'm going to follow up, and I'll convert this into my own Substack and push this out there and send people your way to talk to you while I'm out of the country for the next few weeks, or for the next few days, excuse me. And hope people will share your story. But where can my listeners learn more about the situation? And I hope you're going to continue to do updates, and I will reshare your Substacks and your blogs as best as I can, even from abroad, over the next couple of days. But please link to your Substack and ways for people to connect with you both, if you can.
So we are on Instagram at the Appalachian Homestead. We have a website, AppalachianHomestead.org. We are on YouTube, but we mostly only put our recipes and canning and such on there. And of course, we're on Substack, the Appalachian Homestead, on there. And one thing that I'm finding, and I want to toss this in before we stop, is that two things. Number one, people who don't hunt don't seem to understand the difference between national forests and national parks.
Yes.
And they will message me and say, well, are all national parks everywhere closed? And, well, the national parks are damaged. You can't hunt a national park.
Right.
We're talking about we're talking about national forests. And the other thing is that when I shared the map, which you have a copy of now, they look at that map and they see the zones, and then they see all the tannish color zone, and they say, well, look, there's all this other place you can hunt. That's not national forests. Those are not public lands. Those are privately owned. And if you're a crop farmer, you have just spent the last 6 months running every deer off of your property that showed up.
And while she's mentioning that, and I'll say one more thing. If you're not a hunter, or you're not from down here, and you think, well, go hunt somewhere else, just go somewhere else. Well, like our son, he can drive 30 minutes, be on national forest, not that far from home from his wife, his 1-year-old, almost 2-year-old, and his newborn. If he has to go somewhere else in Virginia to utilize the license and his privilege to hunt in Virginia, he's going to have to drive hours to get there. Hours. Yes. Not 30 minutes, not be back home quickly if there's an emergency. Hours. And, he's already scrounging to feed his family. He doesn't have the time or resources to do that. This isn't a recreational trip. This isn't a travel softball team on weekends. This is putting food in his freezer and on his table.
Yes. And I think one thing that we failed, because when you look at that map, it's shrunken down and you don't really have a good scale. But from what the game warden told us, his own words, there's nowhere you can hunt between here and Roanoke.
And you being a Virginian, you may know this and you may not. Where I'm sitting right now in Wise County, and there's a county farther west than us. It's Lee County, Virginia. If you're sitting in Wise County or Lee County, Virginia, or Scott County, way down here in the triangle, we are closer to 6 or 7 other state capitals than we are to the one in Richmond. And wow, man, we're feeling it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people don't know. I've traveled through southwestern Virginia several times, and I wish Northern Virginia was closer, because I love going down there. I love seeing the elk herd that's come back, just traveling through that region. I have a couple state parks to visit and trout streams to trek out. But it really sadly is a forgotten part of Virginia. And I say this even as someone who's a transplant, and I've learned the lay of the land, that politicians will go to these areas whenever they want to win re-election. But when push comes to shove in times of devastation, they're not normally there to be found. And this has been a recurring theme in the 12 years I've lived here. And I'm so grateful to folks like you both, Mark and Shallon, who care about your region, who care about the little Virginian slice of Appalachia and hunting and fishing. It's so important. People just don't know how invaluable these activities are. We support $20 million annually, at least through hunting and fishing in Virginia in totality. Hunting and fishing goes back to restoring the lands, including the George Washington and Jefferson forests. Those monies go back to public lands, to fish stocking programs, hunters education, so much money. And if you were to displace hunters, even a couple, even if something as high as 1,000, that could have a dent in the number of licenses and the related monies that go to our fund in Virginia through Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson. So it's extremely important to know that. So thank you both for coming on. We're going to keep tabs with this story. I would love for you to update me as soon as you get an update when I'm back from Europe in the next week or so. Thank you both for coming on. I hope we can talk again soon and I can be helpful to you as best as I can.
Thank you so much for having us. We're glad to have this conversation, and we hope that the people out there, even who aren't from Virginia, will take notice and contact their federal representation, as well as send those emails to ours. Let them know you're paying attention to what's happening in these national forests because you understand the dangerous precedent that's being set.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.